Alan Singer is a social studies educator in the Department of Teaching, Literacy, and Leadership at Hofstra University in Long Island, New York, and the editor of Social Science Docket, which is a publication of New York and New Jersey Councils for Social Studies. He taught at a number of secondary schools, and he's the author of Education Flashpoints, Fighting for America's Schools, which is based on his award-winning Huffington Post blogs, Teaching to Learn, Learning to Teach, a handbook for secondary school teachers. And we invited Professor Singer on the show in part to talk about education in school, of course, and in part to talk about some interesting research that I fell upon, and Professor Singer's name came popping up over and over again, and that is the history of slavery in New York City. And I think a lot of people are unawares that there was slavery in New York City, that slavery played a major role in New York City, and that even after slavery was abolished in New York, it existed in many other countries and in half the United States. And New York City merchants and businesses actually that are today, we still bank and use these interests to this very day, were involved in their very beginnings in financing the slave trade, which I think is fascinating because we should know about our city and its history, and it might help us to understand some of the circumstances we find ourselves in at different times in this city, such as if you're involved Black Lives Matter and seeing some of the things that have happened here in New York and out in Staten Island with Eric Garner and others. It might give you an insight into what's really going on because it's based in the history of the city and of our country. So thank you very much for joining us, Alan J. Singer.
All right, thank you very much for having me, Paul. But, Paul, isn't New York really still the center? But maybe it's just shifted to Brooklyn.
Or the East Village now. I don't know. Yeah, right. It's going that way. New York, of course, Brooklyn's another city. We all know that. It's not true. So I find it very interesting. I was teaching up in the Bronx in Hunts Point, and there was a cemetery there that was from the initial settlers, English settlers in that region back hundreds of years ago. And we got our students up there involved in actually a class project to find out the location of the slaves that these settlers all we knew had and where they were buried, because everybody eventually has to be buried somewhere, especially in those days. And we discovered that there was, in fact, a hidden slave cemetery that was part of the settler cemetery that, of course, had never had a fence put around it, had never been marked or monitored. And it took students to get the Department of Agriculture to bring ground-penetrating radar, and we actually put that radar over the surface and found we're not allowed to dig into it because you're not allowed to dig into a potential cemetery in New York City for good reason. But you could find, using radar, anomalies in the soil that point to the possibility that that's where the slave burial ground was located, that together with the actual documents and reports that were available from those days. That was fascinating. It was quite a learning experience for the students, and to have that history brought to life in that way. And so that got me so interested in it. And so I found your work, Professor Singer, that just you were obsessed about it, and I love that because we need to have people interested in information that it seems like nobody else is interested in, so we can bring it out because it's so important. And so my first question I wanted to ask you was, what was the extent of slavery in New York City? A little known fact about New York City history.
Well, slavery in New York City and state gradually ended between 1800 and 1827. In 1799, New York passed a Gradual Emancipation Act. In the colonial era, although the population of New York City and the surrounding area was quite small, enslaved Africans were a significant part of the population. The British, for taxation purposes, kept very detailed tax records. According to a 1703 British census, the total population of New York, Kings, Queens, Westchester, and Richmond counties was only about 13,000 people. But about 13% of that population, about 1,700 people, were enslaved Africans. By the time of the American Revolution, the population of these counties was a little over 60,000 people. About 10,500, 17%, were enslaved Africans. In Kings County, today's Brooklyn, enslaved Africans were about one-third of the population at the time of the American Revolution. Enslaved Africans were about 20% of the population of Queens County, which included present-day Queens and Nassau. So enslaved Africans played a major presence in colonial and early national New York.
I see. And who owned these slaves in New York City, and why did they own slaves? We don't have plantations. I don't think they'd grow cotton,
No.
and that's the what we sometimes associate in our minds with slavery in America. But this must have been a very different type of slavery.
Yeah. Well, some ways yes, some ways no. Cotton and sugarcane, which are the two major crops grown by enslaved Africans in the Americas, are limited geographically. So sugarcane really in the continental United States can grow in Florida, Louisiana, but not further north. Cotton itself, the growing season for cotton pretty much ends the Tennessee-Virginia border. So these crops will not grow in the New York area. Tobacco, which was another crop grown by enslaved labor, does grow in the Connecticut River Valley.
I see.
In Dutch New Amsterdam, the largest slaveholders were the Dutch West Indies Company and its officers, principally Peter Stuyvesant. Africans built the infrastructure of that town. They drained swamps down by what is now Foley Square. They dredged the harbors. They cleared the land of forests so it could be used for farming. They built the roads. They constructed fortifications. They constructed fortifications for the Dutch along what is Wall Street. They constructed fortifications for the British, what is now Chambers. They built St. Paul's, which is the chapel that still exists from the 18th century, and they built their original Trinity Church. Mm-hmm. So enslaved Africans were involved. They built the infrastructure of the city.
I see.
Now, initially, their legal status was unclear because there were no formal slavery in the Netherlands or in Western Europe at the time. And interesting, an early group of enslaved men secured at least partial freedom and land from the Dutch West Indies Company in exchange for serving in the colonial militia. They were settled on borderlands as a barrier against attack by native people, and they still owed the company work obligations. And they actually owned the area that is now Washington Square Park.
Oh, wow.
Conditions for enslaved Africans became much more rigid and onerous after the British conquest of New York in 1664. The British formalized slave law and status, incorporating rules that were developed in the Caribbean and in Virginia.
Harsh conditions, you're saying. Very harsh conditions.
Yes, people were physical punishment. The laws, limited the ability of owners to execute enslaved Africans, but not physical punishment. And in 1714 and some 1712, and again in 1741, enslaved Africans who were suspected of plotting rebellions were burned alive in Foley Square. They were hung. They were drawn and quartered. I mean, the punishment for wanting to be free was severe.
I see.
Now, let me just explain the work. In Kings and Queens County, it was a little bit different. In Manhattan, people are working, even after the land is cleared, they're working on the docks, in haulage. Some people are working skilled laborers, carpenters and smiths. Wealthier New Yorkers also used enslaved Africans as servants and livery drivers. However, in Kings, Queens, and what is now the Bronx, but in those days was considered Westchester, people were working on farms. In Kings and Queens County, we're looking at small farms. We're looking at less than 4 enslaved Africans per plot overwhelmingly. There were very few cases where there were larger holdings of enslaved people. Mm-hmm. In the Bronx, there were a couple of large holdings, particularly Morrisania, which was owned by the Morris family. So people in, again, the Bronx, Queens, and in Kings County, they're working on small farms, primarily producing foodstuffs for them to sell in town. But in Manhattan itself, people are primarily doing other kinds of jobs. One of the things that happens in Manhattan is that enslaved Africans are rented out, not just purchased. And New York City establishes a slave market at Wall Street where it lands at the docks on Pearl Street. There was actually a formal slave market where enslaved Africans would be purchased, but could also be rented out for particular tasks.
And there was a slave burial ground discovered. Of course, it's now a federal monument over in downtown by the Federal Building in Foley Square area as well.
Yeah.
Right?
Well, what happens is that the northernmost border of New York City at the time of the American Revolution is Chambers Street. That's where the wall is. Mm-hmm. Although enslaved Africans are allowed to pray at St. Paul's and Trinity, and they were helped did major work constructing it, they were not allowed to be buried in the church grounds because they were considered, though they were Christian, to be heathen. So enslaved Africans had to be buried outside the city limits. So their burial ground was just outside the wall on Reed, essentially between Center and Broadway.
Yeah, it's worth any New Yorker or anybody who comes to New York to visit to take a walk by there.
It's a very powerful trip. As a matter of fact, this Sunday, I'm taking a group of high school students from Minnesota to visit the burial ground, though the museum is closed on Sundays.
I see.
One of the things we will do is we'll circle up, and everybody will sing Amazing Grace.
Wonderful. And I want to fit that in towards the end because I want to ask you about the teaching part of it, too.
Okay.
And establishing some other aspects of New York City in the slave era and after that I think people don't know about, and that was the role of New York City banks and other businesses in bankrolling slavery even after it was abolished in New York, and how they backed the sugar and cotton industries around the world, and in the American South, which was a major support for the slave system. At least I believe that, right?
Yeah, no, it's true. If you look at a map of the Atlantic coast of the United States, you can understand why New York City became the nation's 19th century trading hub and the leading city in the whole world. First, it has a large sheltered harbor. Boats come in under the Verrazano Bridge, and you have this large area which is protected from storms. In addition, not only was the city connected to the Great Lakes region by the Hudson River and the Erie Canal, but it was advantageously located on the Atlantic Gulf Stream current that runs from the Caribbean north and then across to Western Europe. This meant that slave-produced commodities from the Caribbean, primarily sugar, and from the South, mostly cotton, could be loaded onto smaller coastal vessels, shipped to New York, and then reloaded on transatlantic vessels for shipment to Europe. The city's shipping, banking, insurance industries were all involved in either the transatlantic slave trade up until the American Civil War or in handling slave-produced commodities. Prominent New Yorkers, such as Mayor William Havemeyer, banker Moses Taylor, who was a founder of the Citibank predecessor bank. And
Havemeyer was the founder of Domino Sugar, right?
Yes,
the sugar company.
Havemeyer Sugar becomes Domino. And they're leading of New York, and they are involved in the sale of slave-produced commodities. Now, Moses Taylor had a full-service company. He and the other bankers, they loaned Cuban planters money against their crop to purchase land, seed, tools, and people. They arranged New York purchases and trips. They arranged to educate their children of the planters. They took care of processing through the customs house and the transfer and shipping of the products overseas. Some send brokers to the South to purchase cotton at local markets. At the time of the American Civil War, Southern planters were in such great debt to New York City merchants and bankers that Fernando Wood, who was the city's mayor, suggested that the city secede along with the South to protect its investments.
Wow.
But it gets even worse. For the same reason, Wood, in Congress in 1864, opposed the 13th Amendment ending slavery, because if slavery ended, Southern planters would be unable to repay their debts.
Oh, my word. All right. So we see the role of New York City institutions, banks, and political leaders in bankrolling and supporting the industries that use slaves. But then you've discovered some information that was fascinating to me about their direct role in actually abducting slaves, even though it was illegal and punishable by execution in the United States at the time.
The transatlantic slave trade was declared illegal for U.S. citizens in 1807, and it was made a capital offense in 1820. But the domestic slave trade remained legal between 1800 and 1860, and millions of enslaved Africans were forcibly marched south to new cotton plantations in Alabama, Mississippi, Arkansas, and Louisiana. Now,
marched south from New York?
Said it was illegal to transfer enslaved Africans in that period out of state. However, Sojourner Truth testifies that she had a number of children who were illegally sold down south. So the law said no, but reality said yes. Now, at the same time, New York merchants were involved in illegally smuggling enslaved Africans into Cuba to support an expanding sugar industry. Cuba was late into sugar, but in 1793, enslaved Africans in Haiti rebelled and took over the country. In response, European nations and the United States shifted sugar production largely to Cuba, but Cuba needed workers. Now, what happens is British, more actively in the United States, are trying to suppress the slave trade. In 1854, a ship's captain operating out of New York City was arrested after a feud with his crew, and his trial as a slave trader was covered on the front page of the New York Times. He was convicted, but because he was not a U.S. citizen, he only spent a year in jail and he paid a small fine. In today's money, the human cargo he brought to Cuba on just one voyage was worth over $4 million. Now, in his testimony, he argued that New York was the largest port in the transatlantic slave trade. Boats were built, they were outfitted, they were supplied in the port of New York. Moses Taylor's office was just south of Fulton Street, and today it is still the site of major Citibank offices. On Fulton Street itself, there are buildings that date back to the 1810s, and one of the buildings was the locale. It was a restaurant bar called Sweets where the slave traders used to meet. So Captain Smith, outraged that he was going to be sent to jail, ratted out everybody else. And it's all on the front page of the New York Times.
Wow, that's amazing. And I think it's not talking as an educator, and you are a person who teaches as well as who teaches students who are, as well as the teachers who teach those students. And can you tell us what's missing in our New York City public education that, as fine as it is and as wonderful as the work of most of the teachers in our system are, how come they don't know this stuff except for a handful of very forward-thinking teachers like Justin Zarka and Phil DiPaolo and all the rest of the people who are involved?
Well, first let me say, there is some very good curriculum material that's now being introduced. And your friend, my friend, Phil Panaritis, who is in charge of curriculum in the Bronx, has largely been responsible for this. So there is some very good material. But there are a couple of real problems. The first problem dates back to the 1990s. New York State, after 2 decades of fighting about what should be included in multiculturalism, decided to focus its curriculum on human rights. But there was a problem. And the problem is this. They had a curriculum that was developed on the right of people to food in the Great Irish Famine. They didn't need a curriculum on the right to life in the European Holocaust because many already existed. But there was no agreement on what should go into the curriculum on slavery, the transatlantic slave trade, and the right of people to freedom. The state envisioned a curriculum focusing on the Underground Railroad, New York and the Freedom Trail. But it did not realize, did not anticipate that there needed to be material on New York's complicity with slavery. So what happens is the state never adopted a formal curriculum on New York and slavery. So that's a big problem. The other big problem is that New York State in order to prep kids for Common Core tests which are beginning today and will take the whole week, has focused overwhelmingly on skill acquisition. New York State used to have a social studies exam in 5th grade and a standardized exam in 8th grade. Both exams have been dropped. As a result, kids don't learn history till they get to high school because it's not tested in elementary and middle school.
The focus is on reading, writing, basically that. Reading, writing, arithmetic. That's
reading, writing, arithmetic, and you don't have to know any content. And so people have had to struggle to include the history of slavery in the United States. Look, the African American Museum, which opened this fall, is a great achievement. But New York really doesn't have a permanent exhibit on the history of slavery and African American history in this city. And that also makes it harder to teach. Now, one other thing I think is very important, and I learned this lesson from a high school student a number of years ago.
Yeah.
It's not enough to teach about oppression. We also have to teach about resistance. We have to teach about the way people fought back. Both things, if we want students to become engaged, have to be included. New York was a divided city on the issue of slavery. Silk merchants Lewis and Arthur Tappan, two white men, two Christian evangelicals, were among the nation's leading abolitionists in the 1830s. They are the ones who arranged the defense of the Amistad captives. Henry Ward Beecher.
From the movie Amistad, by the way, if you want the background.
Right. Henry Ward Beecher, also white and a leading Protestant minister in Brooklyn, may have been the nation's staunchest abolitionist leading up to the Civil War. Of course, there were also people complicitous with slavery, including the Roman Catholic Archbishop of the city. And the New York City Democratic Party, especially its Tweed Ring, was notorious in its support for the South. There were also a number of African American who were of crucial importance in the struggle against slavery, and they were based in New York. New York City had a vigilance committee that rose up, led by a man named David Ruggles, and it rose up to help people who were being kidnapped and recaptured to resist capture. Henry Highland Garnett, who was a freedom seeker, parents self-liberated him when he was a child, who grew up in New York and later became a Presbyterian minister in the city, was one of the most radical opponents of slavery, calling for active resistance. Mm-hmm. So we need a curriculum, and we need to focus not just on the complicity of New York City and the nation with slavery, but also resistance. Resistance by white abolitionists and resistance by black abolitionists.
I see. And last couple of minutes here, Alan Singer, this has just been a fascinating discussion, and it's just so much new information, and I think folks around the city and around the country need to learn more about this, and we need to get this in our schools more, without a doubt, so people know the history and the extent of it. Where do you think, in light of the Trump administration and Betsy DeVos, where is it? Is there going to be an effect on New York? Do you think the national the scene is going to impact on how things like this subject are taught in New York City and other places around the country?
It's hard to say what Trump and DeVos will do on Tuesday when they don't know what they're going to do on Monday, and they may not do the same thing on Thursday. A bigger problem for us in New York is that Governor Andrew Cuomo essentially shares their same agenda. You know, he has pushed for the testing. He has pushed to punish schools and families that have opted out of the exams. So I think our problem in this case is much closer to home. I want to make a plug, though.
Go ahead.
How people can learn more. I did write a book for SUNY Press called New York and Slavery, Time to Teach the Truth. And people could read that. I also have a book which is I'm working on with SUNY Press. It's called New York's Grand Jubilee Celebration, about abolitionists and New York black and white abolitionists' struggle for freedom. I have a lot of material on my website through Hofstra, and that's free for everybody to use. So if your teachers has a lot of the primary source documents that people can consider. So there are places to look and there are things to find. And people want to look at my book and books, I'd be very pleased.
So we could have an underground schooling system if necessary, like in the days of slavery when you used to secretly teach people how to read because it was against the law.
Yes. In the 18th century, it was against the law. However, New York did pioneer African free schools, starting. It was interesting. There was a twist. There was some push in New York to teach enslaved Africans to read so they could be proper Christians and read the Bible. And then starting in the 1790s, New York pioneered African free schools. And a lot of the people become active abolitionist movement come out of the African free schools.
I see. Very interesting. So it is important to make sure that that everybody's history gets taught in New York City and not just from one perspective, but there's many perspectives.
Well, one of the things I argue is the slavery and the struggle against slavery is not black history. This is New York history. This is American history. This is the history that everybody must know and come to terms with.
Very good. Thank you very much, Alan Singer, for joining us, a social studies educator at the Department of Teaching, Literacy, and Leadership at Hofstra University. Thank you so much. And we'll have to have you on again to talk more about this.
All right. Thank you very much for having me.